The mist didn't just sit on the River Tiffey. It seemed to crawl up the muddy banks on phantom legs and creep into the town. It wound through the narrow streets, soaking into the austere, soot-stained red brick of the Feathers until the masonry turned the colour of a fresh bruise. Downstairs the pub was a sanctuary, a golden amber bubble held against the pressing dark. It hummed with the comforting, low-frequency vibration of local gossip and the clinking of heavy glass. In the town of Wymondham, there were several places for locals to spend their evenings, but the Feathers stood out. It possessed an atmosphere unlike any other, an 18th-century coaching inn with thick, impenetrable walls and high sash windows that rattled like teeth in the wind. Despite the centuries of coming and going, it still felt strangely fresh. This was partly due to Julie's warmth and partly due to the locals, though they might grumble if you sat on their favourite bar stool, the one with the permanent dip in the fabric. The locals were a jolly sort. They tolerated the odd characters that every well-loved drinking establishment attracts. Men like old Mick, who spent his Tuesdays trying to teach his mongrel dog, Faith, to bark the rhythm of the national anthem, or Jim, not just a character, but afflicted with uncontrollable Tourette's. Jim was perhaps the most cherished soul in Wymondham, despite the heavy tweed coat he wore regardless of the heat, and the Tourette's that caused his head to occasionally snap to the side as he barked out a sharp, involuntary teapot or a sudden rhythmic clicking of his tongue. He was the town's beating heart. He was the first to volunteer for the church fete and the man who knew everyone's birthday. The regulars didn't just tolerate him, they looked out for him. They would simply nudge their glasses aside to give him room and continue their circular, never-ending conversations regarding the Canaries and the many ups and downs the football club had endured over the seasons, always making sure Jim was included in the fold. But Julie, the landlady, hadn't heard a word of the conversation all night. Her ears were tuned to the ceiling, vibrating with a desperate, internal frequency. Every time the ceiling thrummed upstairs, Julie's hand would tremble, spilling a slow, dark splash of the night's most popular ale, the Crusty Claw, onto the polished bar. She watched the liquid spread like a bloodstain. She knew the geography of her pub better than anyone. That specific wet thud wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the natural settling of the Georgian masonry. It was the shifting weight of the twins. When the last local had finally stumbled out toward Town Green, their footsteps swallowed by the fog, and the heavy iron bolts were thrown home, Julie didn't head to the cellar to line up the barrels. Instead, she reached behind the whiskey optics. Her fingers trembled as she found the hidden notch where she now kept the brass key the previous landlord had left behind. It felt cold as a coin from a dead man's eye. The stairs felt steeper tonight, the cold stone steps slick with a moisture that shouldn't have been there. The air grew progressively colder the higher she climbed, turning thick and stagnant. It carried a scent that reminded her of wet moss, old iron, and stagnant pond water, the smell of things that should have stayed buried beneath the earth. She reached the door of the attic room, a space officially closed for renovations, and eased it open. The hinges didn't just squeak, they let out a long, protesting shriek that echoed off the unyielding brickwork of the hallway. The sight inside never became easier to bear. In the centre of the room, bathed in the sickly, rhythmic flicker of a single yellow bulb, stood the horror she had inherited along with the lease. It was a parasitic bond that the brewery's contracts never mentioned in print, yet every landlord of the Feathers had honoured for centuries in a silent, terrified tradition. A towering, skeletal figure stood swaying by the window. Its skin was the translucent green of a dying leaf, stretched so tight over its ribs that the bone threatened to puncture the surface like a tent pole. Its eyes, huge, bloodshot and bulging, stared out at the black silhouette of Wymondham Abbey in a permanent state of traumatic shock. A constant, rhythmic drip of black bile fell from its mouth, sizzling slightly as it ate into the old floorboards. Seated in a velvet armchair, which was now stained a deep, permanent mahogany, was the other half. Plump, pink and unnervingly smooth, the baby sat with a faint, dimpled smile. He looked like a Victorian doll brought to life with far too much meat, his skin glowing with a faint, feverish heat. Between them the cord, a thick, pulsating umbilical rope, tugged taut. It vibrated with a low, wet hum, a sound like a heartbeat heard through water. Julie watched the visible surge of life essence being sucked from the starving green giant and forced into the swelling, healthy belly of the sitter. Julie approached with a bucket of raw offal she'd scavenged from the butcher's scraps. The smell was overpowering in the small room. She didn't feed the baby. Its mouth was a vestigial slit, a mere decorative feature on its doughy face. Its teeth and throat were far too weak to chew and swallow. It was the green one, the engine, that had to be fed. As Julie held out a handful of gristle and grey meat, the gaunt-faced creature opened its mouth with the sound of a wet tear. As it began to grind the offal between yellowed, flat teeth, the baby let out a gurgling, childlike giggle that made the hair on Julie's neck stand rigid. "Nearly there," Julie whispered, her voice cracking with a mixture of pity and sickening revulsion. "The Abbey bells will ring soon. Just hold on." The plump twins' eyes suddenly shifted. They left the shadows of the rafters and locked onto Julie's. For the first time, the serene, doll-like smile twitched into something hungrier, something predatory. It wasn't satisfied with the butcher's scraps anymore. It wanted something that breathed. It was 3 years ago, during the record-breaking heat wave of July. The massive red bricks of the Feathers had been radiating heat like a furnace, and the air in the upper floors had felt like a physical weight, thick with the smell of trapped breath and hot lime mortar. Julie had been clearing out the rooms upstairs. Henderson hadn't stayed for the handover. He'd left the keys on the bar, his hands shaking so violently they rattled the brass, and vanished toward the coast before the ink on the lease was even dry. But as the heatwave peaked, the building shifted, and the upstairs doors swelled and became stuck. Julie, fueled by a mix of new owner ambition and a hammer, pried all the heavy doors open. When she finally opened the last door, she expected dry rot or a collapsed ceiling. She didn't expect the sudden, violent drop in temperature. The air in the attic plummeted 20 degrees the moment the seal was broken. In the corner, huddled behind a moth-eaten privacy screen, she heard it, the sound of a heavy, wet bellowing echoing off the cold, exposed interior brick. She moved the screen, and her flashlight slipped from her numb fingers, clattering on the floor. Back then, the green one was taller, his skin a more vibrant, mossy hue. He was standing over a small wooden cradle that looked centuries old, his long fingers gripping the rails. The umbilical cord wasn't the thick, pulsing rope it was today. It was thin and translucent, like a strand of spider silk catching the light. The baby was no larger than a grapefruit, a pale, twitching mass of doughy flesh. Julie's first instinct was to scream, to run out of the Feathers, but as she reached the bottom of the stairs, she saw a piece of vellum weighted down by a heavy, rusted iron nail that Mr. Henderson had left. Why had she not seen it before, she thought. The vellum didn't feel like paper. It felt like a heavy, cold petal of skin that had been pressed between the pages of a Bible for 100 years. The script at the top was an elegant, sweeping calligraphy that seemed to shimmer with a faint, oily light. To the one who holds the keys, understand that you have not purchased a business, but have entered into a biological stewardship. The Feathers is a body of brick with a singular, hidden metabolism that must be maintained if the town of Wymondham is to sleep in peace. In the high chamber, the sitter and the engine exist in a sacred, parasitic balance. They are the shadow of the Abbey's bells, and their hunger is the tax the land collects from the hearth. Your duty is simple yet absolute. You are the stoker of the engine. You must provide the standing one with enough organic mass, the rinds of the beast, the grey gristle of the butcher's floor, the offal of the field, so that he may funnel life through the cord and into the sitter. For centuries, the scraps of the animal have sufficed to keep the cord thin and the sitter small, but heed this warning: the cord is a seeking root. If the engine is allowed to hollow out, or if the mass provided lacks the heat of vitality, the sitter will command the cord to find the nearest beating heart within these walls. It will find you, landlord. It will stitch itself into your navel while you sleep, and you will feel your skin turn the translucent green of river moss as your bones stretch to accommodate the sitter's growing weight. The moment the current engine withers into a husk, the Feathers clause is enacted. You will become the new vessel. You will stand by the high window, skeletal and serving, a biological battery for the King-in-Cradle, waiting for the next fool to sign the lease and take your place at the bar. Feed the engine, landlord. Feed him anything but yourself. For as long as the standing man swallows, you remain the master. The moment he fails, you become the meal. Julie looked from the note to the shivering emerald man. She looked at his face, sunken, distorted, but still holding the ghostly, stretched-out features of the man who had owned the pub in the 1880s. She had seen a painting of him still hanging just above the bar. She wasn't a guardian. She was a replacement. Henderson hadn't just vanished. He had escaped a death sentence by handing the noose to her. The record of the tithe wasn't a history book. It was a countdown. Back in the present, Julie thought back to when she had tried to escape. She had listed the lease for next to nothing, praying some corporate chain would take it on. But buyers sensed the rot. They would stand in the bar, shivering, and leave without an offer. Without a buyer, she couldn't leave. The first time she tried to run toward Cock Street, an incredible, white-hot pain had flared in her stomach, a physical hook in her navel dragging her back to the bricks of the Feathers. She shivered as she remembered that first day. The baby was no longer a grapefruit. He was a bloated, smiling master, his flesh spilling over the sides of the velvet chair, and the cord between them was now thick enough to carry a gallon of life essence a minute. The green giant's eyes pleaded with her, sunken so deep into his skull they were little more than dark pits of despair. But now, Julie saw something else in the room. The shadows near the velvet armchair were lengthening, detaching themselves from the limestone floor and moving toward her feet like spilled ink. The baby wasn't just smiling anymore. His dimpled hands, each finger the size of a sausage, were gripping the arms of the chair with impossible strength. For the first time in 3 years, he made a sound that wasn't a giggle or a gurgle. It was a command. "More!" the pink thing wetly croaked, the sound vibrating in Julie's very marrow. The word "more" still echoed in her bones as Julie backed out of the room, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She fumbled with the heavy brass key, her vision blurring. She needed to think. She needed to find a way to satisfy the pink one without becoming the meal herself. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, a sudden movement by the solid mahogany bar made her heart lurch. A figure was stumbling out from the shadowed hallway that led to the toilets. It was Jim. His heavy tweed coat was rumpled, and his eyes were bleary with sleep. He must have drifted off in the cubicle, tucked away from the world while Julie was locking the heavy iron bolts. "Lost track of time, Julie," Jim muttered, his voice thick and kind. His head twitched violently to the left. "Biscuits!" he shouted at the empty room, followed by a sharp, rhythmic snapping of his fingers. He didn't seem to notice her terrified expression. "Need to head home to the cottage before the fog turns solid. Promised Mrs. Gable I'd fix her gate tomorrow." But it was too late. From the top of the stairwell came a sound that froze the blood in Julie's veins. The heavy, rhythmic thud-squelch of something massive and wet moving against solid stone and brick. The green one appeared first, his skeletal frame trembling under an impossible weight. He was cradling the pink one in his spindly arms like a grotesque Pieta. The umbilical cord, now thick as a fire hose and pulsing with a violent, violet light, draped over the wrought iron banister, dragging behind them with a wet, raspy sound. The pink one's eyes locked onto Jim. Its dimpled mouth stretched into a wide canyon of hunger. "Fresh," the baby gurgled. Jim's head snapped again. "Wanker!" he barked, immediately followed by, "Sorry, Julie," the sound echoing off the unyielding brick walls. He didn't run. He simply stood there as the shadow loomed over him. "Mrs. Gable," he whispered between a series of rapid whistles, a strange, calm clarity finally settling over his weathered face. Before Julie could scream, the green one lunged. For a creature so gaunt, he moved with the blurring speed of a starving predator, fueled by the sitter's desperate demand. He didn't use claws. He simply opened his jaw, wider than any human anatomy should allow, and clamped down on Jim's shoulder. There was no struggle. Jim, the man who had a kind word for every stranger in Wymondham, seemed to go limp, a willing sacrifice to the town's ancient shadow. Julie watched in paralyzed horror as the green one began to feed, his sunken cheeks filling out even as the life essence was immediately bypassed. The cord between the twins began to thrum. Julie could see the liquid life, a sickening, glowing slurry, surging through the umbilical rope, forced from the green one's throat directly into the pink one's belly. The baby let out a long, satisfied sigh, its skin turning from a feverish pink to a healthy porcelain-white. It began to grow right before her eyes, its limbs lengthening, its doughy face sharpening into something that looked terrifyingly human. The green one remained a husk, a mere funnel for the slaughter. As Jim's boots finally stopped scraping against the limestone, the pink one turned its gaze back to Julie. It wasn't just a monster anymore. It was becoming a king. The Abbey bells began to toll, not the slow, rhythmic call to prayer, but a frantic, clashing alarm that shook the very foundations of the brickwork. The tithe had been paid, but the debt was only growing. The following morning, the mist had retreated, leaving the streets of Wymondham glistening and cold. The heavy oak doors of the Feathers creaked open as they always did, but the air inside felt different, thinner, as if the very oxygen had been taxed by the heavy red walls. The regulars began to trickle in for the lunchtime opening. Old Mick was there, Faith sitting dutifully by his feet, and the Canary's crew took their usual positions, leaning against the bar to dissect the weekend's upcoming match. But there was a hole in the room. Jim's stool, the one near the end of the bar where the light caught the amber of the optics, sat empty. It was a small thing, a few square inches of leather, yet it felt like a canyon had opened up in the center of the pub. "Jim's late," Mick remarked, glancing at the door. "Usually here by now to tell me my faith's bark is out of key." A few of the others nodded, their eyes drifting to the empty seat. "Probably popped into the cold blow for a pint after he finished fixing Mrs. Gable's gate," one added. "He was saying only yesterday they are selling a new ale there he wants to try." Julie stood behind the taps, her hands moving with a mechanical, jerky precision. She didn't look up. She couldn't. Every time she reached for a glass, she saw the faint, scrubbed clean indentation on the cold floor where Jim's boots had last rested. She had spent hours with a bucket of bleach and a wire brush, scrubbing until her knuckles bled. But in her mind, the floor was still stained mahogany. "You all right, Julie?" Mick asked, his voice softening. "You look like you've seen a ghost. Or maybe just a bad batch of the claw." "I'm fine, Mick," she lied, her voice sounding like dry parchment. "Just didn't sleep well. The wind was loud." As she pulled a pint, the sound of the liquid hitting the glass echoed the rhythmic thud-squelch she had heard on the stairs. Her hand trembled, and a splash of ale spilled onto the bar. "I hope Jim will be here soon," said Mick. "I'm sure he will be," said Julie, her eyes meeting the empty stool where Jim should be. High above, in the room that didn't exist, she knew the king was resting, his skin white as porcelain, his belly full of the kindness and the biscuits and the teapots of a man who had loved this town more than himself. She looked towards the ceiling, where the faint, rhythmic thump of a healthy heart vibrated through the 18th century joists. The debt was settled for now, but she knew that sooner or later the king would grow hungry again, and she would have to decide whose seat would be empty next. The heavy oak door swung open, and a man drifted in on a cloud of expensive cologne and cold arrogance. He was wearing a quilted designer gilet and leather loafers that had never seen a muddy Tiffey bank. He didn't hang his coat. He draped it over the bar, cutting off Mick's reach to the peanut bowl. "God, the signal in this backwater is pathetic," the man snapped, not at Julie, but at the air. He didn't look at her until he'd finished typing a message, his thumbs clicking loudly on the screen. "You, landlady, give me a double scotch, neat, and make sure the glass is actually clean. I've seen the state of the windows out there." Old Mick's jaw tightened. The Canary's crew shifted in their seats, a collective growl forming in their chests. This was the moment Julie usually stepped in with a sharp word or a polite, "We don't care for that tone here." The stranger scanned the room with a sneer, his eyes landing on the end of the bar. "Finally, a seat that isn't falling apart," he muttered. He marched over to Jim's stool, the chair that still held the phantom shape of a man who loved every brick of Wymondham, and kicked it back with his heel. "Stinks of damp tweed over here," the man grumbled, sitting down and placing his phone directly onto the spot where Jim used to rest his weathered hands. "You people ever heard of a dehumidifier, or progress?" Julie stared at him. She looked at his thick, pulsing neck, flushed pink from the cold. She looked at his hands, soft, pampered, and full of the vibrant life force that comes from a life of taking. From the ceiling, a heavy, wet thud-squelch vibrated through the joists. It was louder than usual, a demanding, rhythmic throb that made the whiskey bottles rattle in their cradles. The king had smelled the intruder. Julie felt the itch behind her own navel, the phantom tug of the cord, begin to fade as she focused on the man. A cold, terrifying calm settled over her. "The stool is private, mate," Mick growled, his voice trembling with a last-ditch effort to save a stranger who didn't deserve it. Someone special sits there." The man let out a sharp, barking laugh. "He isn't here now, is he? Unless you've got a ghost sitting on it. It's a chair, Grandad. Get over it." Julie reached for a heavy crystal tumbler. She polished it with a slow, deliberate circle of her cloth until it gleamed like a bone. She reached for the top-shelf Isla, the most expensive bottle in the house, and poured a double. The amber liquid hissed against the glass. "He's right, Mick," Julie said, her voice smooth and chillingly hollow. She slid the scotch across the bar, the glass stopping perfectly at the man's manicured fingertips. For the first time, she smiled, a wide, porcelain expression that didn't move her eyes. "It's just a chair, and we're so very glad to have someone substantial filling it." The man smirked, leaning back and spreading his arms. "See, the lady has some sense. Leave the bottle, sweetheart. I'm going to be here for a while." "Oh, I know you are," Julie whispered. She glanced at the ceiling above them. The king's joyous gurgle was joined by a second, higher-pitched, wet trill. Julie felt a strange maternal warmth bloom in her chest. She looked at the man, not as a customer, but as a harvest. She realized then that the grief for Jim had been replaced by a new, darker purpose. The pub wasn't just a business anymore. It was a larder. As long as the world kept sending men like this, loud, empty, and full of meat, the king in the attic would never go hungry. She would keep the fire lit, the doors unlocked, and the private stool waiting. "Drink up," she said. "The first one is on the house. The rest, well, the rest will cost you everything you've got." As the day turned to night, the mist outside the Feathers seemed to thicken, pressing its grey face against the window panes as if trying to witness the transaction. It was getting closer to closing time, and inside, the golden amber bubble of the bar felt suddenly brittle, a thin film of light stretched over an ancient, hungry void. The man in the gilet, now a bit worse for wear, took a long, arrogant draw of his scotch, the ice clinking against the crystal with a sound like shattering teeth. He didn't notice the way the other regulars had gone silent, a heavy, leaden silence that sat in the gut like cold suet. Old Mick shared a look with the Canary's crew. Then slowly, without a word, they finished their pints and began to gather their coats. They didn't look at Julie. They didn't look at the stranger. They looked at the floor, their faces etched with the weary, complicit grief of a town that knew the price of its own peace. "Funny place, this," the man remarked, oblivious, his voice cutting through the sudden vacuum. "A bit too quiet, if you ask me. Needs music. A bit of atmosphere." "The atmosphere is coming," Julie replied. She was already moving toward the heavy iron bolts of the front door. It just takes a moment to settle. One by one, the locals filed out into the fog. Mick paused at the threshold, his hand trembling on Faith's collar. He looked back at Julie, his eyes pleading for a denial, for a sign that she wasn't truly the woman he'd known for years. Julie simply nodded once, a sharp, professional tilt of the head. "Go home, Mick. Sleep well." The heavy oak door thudded shut. The iron bolts shrieked as they slid home, a sound that finally made the stranger turn around, his glass halfway to his lips. "Closing early?" he asked, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. "Didn't the sign say midnight?" "Private function," Julie said. She began to turn off the lights, one by one. The amber glow retreated, leaving only the single lamp above the bar to cast long, distorted shadows of the optics against the soot-stained brick. A very exclusive gathering. The thud-squelch from above was no longer a vibration. It was a rhythmic pounding, a heavy, wet heartbeat that seemed to pulse in time with the flickering lamp. The ceiling joists groaned, and a fine dusting of Georgian plaster fell like dry snow into the man's scotch. What the hell is that?" The man stood up, his phone sliding off Jim's stool and hitting the floor with a plastic crack. "Is there a leak? You've got a serious structural issue here, lady." "It's not a leak," Julie said, her voice coming from the shadows behind the beer engines. "It's the king." The door to the attic stairs, the one Julie had left unlatched, creaked open at the top of the darkened hallway. The temperature in the bar plummeted. The man's breath began to hitch in visible white plumes, the expensive cologne on his skin turning cloying and sour in the sudden chill. From the darkness of the hall, two eyes emerged. They weren't the sunken, pleading pits of the previous engine. These were wide, bright, and filled with a terrible, renewed vigor. The green one stepped into the dim light of the bar, his skeletal frame now upright, his mossy skin shimmering with the stolen vitality of Jim's kind soul. The atmosphere in the bar shifted from predatory to frantic. The man in the gilet didn't finish his scotch. With a sudden, panicked burst of adrenaline, he lunged for the door. "This place is mental!" he yelled, his voice cracking. He didn't bother with the handle. He threw his entire weight against the heavy oak. Whether by a fluke of the old hinges or a momentary lapse in the building's grip, the door flew open. He vanished into the white wall of the Tiffey mist, his expensive loafers slapping frantically against the pavement until the sound was swallowed by the fog. Julie stood frozen. The feather's claws hadn't been completed. It flared in her gut, a white-hot, agonizing hook pulling at her navel. She had failed the tithe. The standing one, the king, shrieked, a sound like tearing metal, the cord now turning black with necrotic tension. The green one loomed over Julie, his jaw unhinging with the sound of a wet leather boot being pulled from the mud. His long, mossy fingers, each knuckle a knot of ancient, petrified wood, reached for her throat. The feather's claws were screaming in Julie's blood, the white-hot hook behind her navel dragging her toward the monster's open maw. She was already beginning to feel the phantom stretch in her own shins. Then the Abbey bells erupted. It wasn't the rhythmic chime of the hour. It was a violent, clashing peal, the sound of the town's ancient iron heart protesting the broken balance. The green one's hand stopped inches from Julie's skin. A ripple passed through its translucent green flesh, like a stone thrown into a stagnant pond. The creature's head didn't just turn, it snapped. It was a sharp, violent, 45-degree jerk to the left, a movement so humanly familiar it made Julie's heart stop. A ragged, wet sound emerged from the creature's throat. It wasn't the hiss of the engine. It was a struggle of vocal cords being relearned. Biss, biss, biss. The monster groaned, its chest heaving. A thick, black drop of bile leaked from its lip, but its eyes, the pits of emerald despair, began to brighten with a weathered Norfolk blue. "Biscuit," it finally barked. The sound was a thunderbolt in the quiet bar. It was Jim's voice, filtered through a throat of moss and iron, but unmistakably his. Behind him, the pink one let out a frustrated, predatory hiss. The cord pulsed with a violent violet light, trying to pump the king's will back into the green one's limbs. Julie watched in horror and wonder as the green one's right hand began to fight its left. The left hand reached for Julie, fingers hooked like talons, while the right hand slammed down onto the bar, gripping the wood so hard the mahogany groaned. "Jim?" Julie whispered, her voice trembling. The creature's head snapped again. "Teapot!" he shouted. The twitch was so violent it nearly threw the monster off its feet. A look of agonizing concentration settled onto the distorted face. The engine was being hijacked. Jim wasn't just a meal. He was a virus of kindness in a system built on cruelty. For a few heart-stopping seconds, the monster stood frozen, a battlefield of two souls. The pink one, sensing the rebellion, began to crawl forward on its dimpled, sausage-like limbs, its mouth opening to reclaim the power itself. But Jim was faster. He had spent a lifetime volunteering for the hard jobs in Wymondham, and he wasn't about to stop now. "Run, Julie," the monster rasped, the words clear and heavy with the scent of old tweed and tobacco. "Run, love." With a roar of sheer human will, Jim forced the skeletal legs to move. He didn't turn towards the door. He turned back toward the king. He wrapped his long, skeletal arms around the bloated, porcelain body of the sitter in a crushing embrace, not of a servant, but of a man taking out the trash. He lunged toward the great hearth, the massive 18th century fireplace where a low, orange ember of the day's peat fire still glowed. "Wanker!" Jim barked one last time, a triumphant, defiant twitch of the head. With a final agonizing heave, Jim threw himself and the king into the blackened maw of the chimney. As they hit the embers, the ancient, soot-stained bricks of the Feathers let out a literal groan of structural agony. The fire didn't just burn, it turned a violent, violet hue as it consumed the life essence in the cord. A high, thin scream echoed up the chimney flue, followed by the sound of the heavy iron fire grate collapsing. Silence fell over the bar. The phantom hook in Julie's navel snapped, leaving only a dull ache. The oppressive weight of the Georgian masonry lifted, and for the first time in 3 years, the air in the Feathers smelled of nothing but cold ash and old wood. The Abbey bells gave one final, resonant thrum and fell silent. Julie walked to the hearth. There was nothing left but a pile of grey ash and a single, charred scrap of tweed. She knelt, picking up the fabric, her tears carving tracks through the soot on her face. The king was gone. The stewardship was broken. Wymondham was just a town again, and the heavy, spectral shadow that had hung over the streets for centuries had finally dissipated with the morning mist. Years later, the brass on the front door of the Feathers shone with a brightness it hadn't known in generations. The new landlady, a woman who knew nothing of engines or Tiffey mists, had scrubbed away the last of the Georgian gloom. But she was keen on the local history of Wymondham, and she knew a hero when she heard of one. In the corner by the great hearth, where the air always felt particularly warm and still, she had placed a small, permanent tribute. It wasn't a grand plaque. Instead, resting on a small mahogany shelf, sat a simple ceramic teapot and a fresh plate of biscuits, replaced every single morning. Below it, a small hand-painted sign simply read, "For Jim, the man who took out the trash." The Feathers was no longer a cage or a court. It was just a pub, a great, well-loved Wymondham local, where the only thing that lingered was the faint, comforting scent of hoppy ale and the warmth of the fire.